I read the story this week of a businessman that was driving in his car, and he was pretty pleased with himself. He had a brand new Jaguar, a Christian businessman, and was pretty stoked that God gave him a car, you know, and that business had gone so well, and he was trying to get across town, and the crosstown freeway that he was trying to get on, he knew was blocked because he had this sophisticated system in the car that told him wherever he went, you know, the fastest way. So he's doing this thing through town, and he's in a neighborhood, and so he's kind of speeding along, enjoying his car, praising God, and yet he knows that as he's going through this neighborhood, he's got to be pretty careful about what's going on. Kids might dart out and he's looking. And he notices something in his peripheral vision, and all of a sudden, slam into his car. He hits the brakes. He jumps out, and there's this kind of big dent in the rider's side of his car, and right below it is a brick. And this guy he goes ballistic, and then in his peripheral vision, he sees a kid just standing there like this. And he runs over and he grabs this kid by the shoulder and he says, "What are you?" And he's just kind of getting started, and this is going to cost somebody a lot of money. And the child just melts in emotion. And all the boy can do is to point. And when he points, the guy looks over his shoulder and he sees an older child, considerably larger than the boy, that has fallen out of a wheelchair and has hit his head on the curb and is laying there, and he puts the picture all together. This guy's working with this kid, and he couldn't get anyone to stop. So fortunately the boy wasn't hurt badly, and he helped get the boy back into the wheelchair and get the younger boy on his way, taking his older brother wherever they were going. He got into his car that day, and he said to himself, "How is it that I could be so into myself and my version of God that I miss God's plan so completely?" He said, "God, I'm not going to fix the door of this car because I need it as a reminder. I need to tell the story." God has ordained a life and our lives to throw bricks at us to get our attention. The talent of God in the hand of the servant is the test of our hearts. The talent of God in the hand of the servant is the test of our hearts. In the test, we as stewards find a loving God who doesn't need our stuff, who doesn't need our money, who doesn't need our time, is not concerned about the mortgage of this building or the budget of this congregational family. This is a God who wants your heart. This is a God who wants you. This is the everlasting God. This is the God who has no end and has promised you that there is no end to your life. There is no end to our life. It's all done. And if we could live now, like that is true, and set free the stuff that is the test of our hearts, not the appeal to some program or somebody, then we have a life worth living now. We get to start eternity today in the joy of the things that God has for us. You see, today we want to talk about the life of the steward in the story. We've already understood that it is God's intention that every steward live in the abundance of God's hands. And the way to do that is to put God first. And then God has asked us to put first things first, like forgiveness. Like starting each day with God. Each day, first things first. By starting each week with God. Sunday is first things first. By taking a small portion of our income and saying that is first unto God and it blesses everything else. And somehow we've become accustomed to figuring out a way in which that doesn't apply to us. And God isn't punishing anyone for doing that. God just says, when you step under the shade tree of your own common sense and religious thinking, I can't bless you. I'm not cursing anyone. I'm not angry at anyone. What I want you to understand is that when you can be free with me, oh, I am free with you. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. We found out already in this series that not only did Jesus create us at the beginning of the world, at the foundation of the world, Christ gave his life for us. It's all done. God has been giving and giving and says, I want you to have this. I want you to know this. So the abundant life principle this morning is simply this. You can give without loving, but you can't love without giving. There are people that are doing amazing stuff giving around the world. We'll talk a little more about our trip to Africa next week. But I'm just amazed at what people are dumping and pouring because they can give. They got a lot of stuff. They're doing that. But you see, you can do that without loving. But you can't love. If you're having a hard time giving up to God the few things that God is asking us to give to God in the way that God is asking us to give, it's because you don't have the love of God in your heart. You're not set free. It is still frozen and logged jammed inside of you. And what I want to do is put a stick of dynamite in that this week and let you think about it. And then we still have some amazing things to say next week about this parable as we close. But let me say this about the context of the parable before you get hung up. The parable reads like this in the first line. Again, it will be like a man. Let me remind you that the parable language is a language of likeness, not exactness. I've gotten all kinds of comments, we haven't even got there yet, about, well, I could never imagine God treating the last servant the way that he treated him. Well, you'll see that difference. You see, Jesus uses a likeness. In another parable, he encourages the shrewd manager who cheats his way into goodness. And we go, why would God... That's not what God's saying. God's saying, if we were as good as being honest and fair as the world is as good as cheating, guess what? See? That's the parable. Don't get hung up here in the way you think this sounds. And put yourself behind the 8 ball. In the parable of soils, where the seed goes out onto the road, and then it goes into where there's no water, and then where there's water, but there's weeds, and then into good. Well, Jesus says that's an understanding of the heart, but none of those soils can change their hearts. We know that in the real world. So the parables only intersect with the real world. He places the father at the end of the story as the way someone would expect a manager to act, not as the way the father would act. And then once we begin to understand the story, we get to see that, wow, there is something of the father even in that. And there's a huge secret that's going to be revealed in that as we look at it deeper next week. So keep that in mind. We're looking at likeness instead of exactness. We're looking at a resemblance, not a replica. Okay? Keep that in mind. So our story this morning gives us two kinds of stewards. And the first is the steward of faithfulness. The first two. Steward of faithfulness. One was given 5 talents and one was given 2 talents. Okay? And what I want to do is I want to walk through what the Scripture is telling us about that steward. Okay? So we'll just take some time to look at them. The facts to consider about the first 2 stewards are, number 1, their ability. The Scripture says that God knows our personal ability. God knows what we have. God knows who we are. God knows all the liabilities. God knows all the pitfalls in your life. God's got it covered. So about the time we're talking about these things and you're ready to give your excuses, God says, hey, thank you, but I know you. I know all of that. You want to save your excuses for me, that's fine, but hey, or your neighbor, or whoever we're trying to justify the smallness of our life with, you're free to share that. But if you want to live a big life under a big God and be a faithful steward and really get into this life, then let it go and see what happens. You see, the ability and the potential, and even though, and I get this a lot, even though God knows what these 3 stewards are going to do, guess what? They didn't know. You see, the test is on our heart. My wife's amazing. She put up with kindergarten kids most of her life, and trying to figure out how to do all that. And I was really befuddled. Why are we giving kindergartners state tests? And I'm going on and on. And you know their ability. And she goes, my students don't know where they're at. The test is for them. The test isn't for the grade. Those students need to begin to start acclimating their lives to seeing their lives as compared to something else. The test. Just remember that God is big. So what? God's bigness never cancels our freedom. It reveals it. That's how big God is. And so what you see happening in the story of the first 2 stewards is that God, in His bigness, is entrusting them with God's stuff. That's amazing too. They have nothing. They're stewards. They're actually slaves. They have nothing. And God says, here are 5 for you and 2 for you. Look at the heart. That's the second fact to consider. They have hearts. And the first 2 have this heart of, oh boy, woohoo! Yes, sir. The master's smart and shrewd and kind and loving as well. The master would never give me something to do that I would fail. I don't know, God. This is looking really risky. God said, come on, Pastor Jeff. Trust me. How is it that I trust God for salvation, but the day-to-day, that's where it gets tough? The outcome here, it's beautiful. It says, seek the work and the praise of God. Both of these stewards come back and say, check it out. It worked. Just like you said. And they bring the money back in. And finally, then check out the abundance. 2 things happen to them. Each of those stewards are given more responsibility. More fun stuff to do for God, of which they have no resources. They just get to do it. And they are drawn into a deeper relationship with God. In the book of Daniel, there's 3 men, you've all heard of them, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, and they got pulled into the whole slavery thing. They could be in Babylon complaining that God doesn't do enough for them and that they're in prison and life's crummy. But they're not. In fact, it's getting worse for them because Nebuchadnezzar has raised a statue and says, you will worship the statue or I will throw you into the fire. Let me read their response. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve will save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not want to save us from the fire, you, O king, will know that we serve no other gods. These three guys felt the love of God, so much so that they said, this goes either way. Either we go into the furnace and we're ashes, or we go into the furnace and we come out and wow. The two stewards were living loved. They knew the love of God. They knew the love of the owner, the manager. And so they freely gave themselves. The second is the fearful steward, the steward of fearfulness. The facts to consider, the abilities are the same. Someone has once asked me, is it better, what's easier, to serve with 5 talents or 1 talent? Most of us in the room, 5, because you have enough to spare. Let me tell you, someone that doesn't give 1 talent when all they have is 1, when they give 5, they're not going to give it then. It's never. Does anyone have enough income here? Does anyone have enough love? Does anyone have enough forgiveness? See, that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is the master gives what the master gives, and I don't look, it's like sitting on an airline. You don't ask the guy next to you what he paid for his ticket. It's a bad discussion to have, right? We don't look at each other and see who's got what. God looks at us and says, this is the ability of this man who I have chosen, and he is also entrusted, and even though I know he may or may not fail, that's not my thing there. It is his test. Now check out his heart. His heart is, oh no! Instead of, oh boy, oh no! Terrible things are going to happen. God's testing me. He's testing me. I got to come up with something here. What if I don't make it? What if it doesn't work out? And all of the fear and the anxiety and the guilt and the excuses and all the things that this person thinks they know because God doesn't, and all of that stuff. Does any of that sound familiar? Don't raise your hand. The outcome is, O Master, you are evil, for you tested me in ways that I could never perform. And so God is made to blame as the bad guy. Oh, I don't know about God. Cancer visit our life. I don't know about God. And fill in the blank. The spot, the place where God did not fulfill your expectation and who got pasted with the bad news. Our understanding of God, the everlasting, the almighty, the one who sets us free. And I didn't get a pony for my birthday? And God's stupid? Yeah, that's what I'm thinking, Keith. You see, instead of abundance, this man has crawled inside the very small box of condemnation, and it's not even God's condemnation. You've got to read this parable. The master asks a question when he says, and you thought I was a mean, cruel, wicked guy? The master's not saying that's who I am. He's saying, you so believe it's me that that's what you're going to condemn yourself to. God's not, the master's not agreeing with the man on principle. He's being a loving master and letting him think what he will, because God is a gentleman and will never force us to change our hearts. If you're going to change your heart here this morning, it's because you're going to change your heart. Not because Pastor Jeff has eloquent words or God's going to and do something to you. That just doesn't happen in this Bible. And so if something's going to happen today, it's because we begin to understand this story. And by the way, what happens when someone has fallen on such disapproval of God and God's church and the things of God, and they cast themselves out? What happens? God goes after them with more love. The church reaches out to them with more affirmation. If we say good riddance, it's because you can give without loving, but you can't love without giving. Story told of a huge monastery in Europe, and the king wanted to see what was going on there. And as he walks on the grounds, he sees that there's hundreds of men there praying and wanting to go to the headmaster and the exact number of how many there are there. He says, how many disciples do you have here, sir? And he says, no more than 4 or 5. You see, we can all get on the religious train. We can all say, oh yeah, God's first in my life. But if God isn't first on Sunday or on Monday, or when you pay the bills, or when it's time to forgive a brother or love an enemy, if God is not first in those first things, wow, where is God first? How is God first? So the steward's test, which is the next thing, is 2 verses. You're familiar with the Malachi verse, but I'm just going to read it for you because you need to see it in the light in which it comes out. So God is concerned that they're robbing him in the Old Testament. Someone says, well, tithing's always in the Old Testament. You know, this verse here is only 15 verses away from the New Testament. That's close enough for me. Okay? It's all the Bible, right? Why did we decide to cut up the Bible when it served us? When it put us under the shade of the tree instead of in the light of God? How is that helping anyone? Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse. There may be food in your house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing on you that you do not have room for it. The test of God's heart, the only place where God says, let me test you, is the test of our heart. How many of us are willing to take this verse and test God? see if God's real. Take the 10% off the top. Let's see if it works. You see, it's already a test of our own heart. I don't know if I want it to work. I don't know if that fits my control structure. So the test of our heart is this strange verse out of Luke 12:34. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Interesting. If I were Jesus, I would have taught that in reverse, right? For where your heart is, that's where your treasure will be. See? God knows something about Pastor Jeff that I often forget, and that is my heart and my virtues follow the things that I put it all into. So God says, I've given things where I may be seen first in your life, and if you throw everything after that, you'll have to follow me with your heart. Because not only is the anchor heavy to hold the ship, the anchor has a chain, and the chain's tied onto the ship, and I need that. See, if I buy a brand new boat, which I wouldn't think of doing, but I'm just not the boat kind of guy, but I'd be out there polishing it, taking care of it, because my money's in it. If I knew anything about the stock market, and I started throwing stuff into it, and I'd start reading the financials. How's it going? God knows this about us. God knows that this is the result of the fall. God didn't make us this way. He made us so that our heart would go first, but He knows it's now reversed. So God is putting first things first to test our heart, and when that happens, it brings us along. My first job in ministry was to be a full-time director of a YMCA camp. This is crazy. Gail and I got married, and when we got married, I had a part-time job for 3 months and nothing else. I'd love to have been a fly on the wall at my parents' house. I knew nothing then. I was in love. Woo! We had just gotten married. We didn't know nothing. Okay? And my parents were so cool. Gail's parents were... Quinter, Gail's dad he should have shot me. Not only did I have long hair and a fast car and $2 in my wallet, I was king of it all. I graduated from college, IR educated. I knew it all. So I wanted this job at the YMCA camp full-time all the way around, but they'd never opened it up. And I remember doing some mission work, and so I told them, I said, why don't I raise support? I wanted the job. I wanted the job so bad I was going to make it into a job. Why don't I just raise support? They said, outstanding, great. So I'm going to the final meeting. I got all my support letters ready to go. We're going to put them in the mail and all of that. And God, Jeff, I want you to go to that meeting tomorrow, and I want you to tell them that you're not sending out any support letters. This is the difference between a faith mission. I'm going to hold you guys a little bit. They're going to make some noise, but you want to hear the end of the story, don't you? So this faith mission thing is when the mission has faith. Those people are making income off the camp, and they can't pay you. You better go get in line over there at McDonald's. Oh, I'm going to be a minister, God. But not that way. So I go to the meeting, and I open up the file, got it already? Yeah, I got it already. So what's the next move? Well, the next move is I can't do this. And in the YMCA in those days, and I'm thinking that it's a little bit worse, the C didn't always mean Christian. And that was true of our executive director. This guy wasn't necessarily a man of faith at all. So as I'm seeing my dream job go down the river, he speaks up and goes, for some reason I've been thinking about this over the last 24 hours, and we're going to figure out a way just to hire you. Because that's the way. And I'm walking out of this meeting, and I'm going, God, what was that all about? God told me, you just got your first job, and you're going to have to start giving 10% and going to a church regularly. Or this is all going to become unraveled. Not because I don't like you, but because, just like you listen to me, that's what you got to do. Well, God, we need to buy a car. We'll go buy a car. We'd never bought anything brand. And we did this for about a year until it was time for me to go to seminary. And I didn't even know what seminary really was, other than some people told me I ought to go there. And so I go to seminary, and I had some promises from some people that were going to help me pay for seminary. And none of those promises came through when I got there. So Gail and I again said, how are we going to pay for this? And I was talking to some students that were getting ready to go, this is how we pay for it. We've made our tithe our payment to the seminary. And they also had crazy ideas like this. We've stopped doing our devotional time because we're studying the Bible so much professionally that we don't need to do that. And God was saying, no, none of those things. You're going to let me pay for this. You're going to let me find a way. 3 years later, we had no bills. Gail had a job in East LA, teaching kids in a small private school. I was a gardener. And this is how God started this life. Now, I know that when we look at this, the first thing you're saying to yourself, well, Jeff, this sounds really hard, and I don't know how I make a jump to 10% of my income. I don't know how I make a jump to letting God be first in all of the things. Just a kind of a final story for us this morning. There was a man who was seeking to understand how God could help him in the difficulty of his life. So he came to a wise man in the church, and this guy had a house up in the mountains. And so he went to visit him, and he says, my life is so full of difficult things, I don't know what to do. And he says, okay, let me show you something. He goes, all right, I'm open. He says, see that bowl of salt there? And this guy had this amazing big bowl of salt just sitting there. He said, yeah. He goes, take a handful of that salt and put it in this cup. Now go to the tap and fill it up with water and take a big drink. So he does this, takes a big chunk and, there it goes. What was that all about? Why did I do that? He goes, come with me. Bring your glass and another handful of salt. So he does. He walks him out to this pristine lake that he has on the property. He says, now take the salt and throw it into the lake. And he did. Now take your glass and see if it's any better. Oh yeah, this is great. He goes, what just happened? He says, I just enlarged your God. If you're going to contain all your problems and all the things that you think you need to do for God in your little cup, you got a bitter life. This is what you hear me talk about when I say some people have just enough Jesus to make them miserable. Yeah. Their cup's too small. God's enlarging our container this morning. God wants to give us a bigness of life and show us that there is something that is going to happen. We have a goal this year that everyone is on a ministry team. We also have a goal this year to help everyone put first things first with God. All the things we've been talking about. And particularly, and this is what's really cool about next week, and the final thing that I want to say about the third service, is that there is an opportunity to give more than what God requires. And for those who do that, there is a hope of the greater abundance of standing in the fullness of God. We are loved by God. God's love for us is true life, and it is better to have God than to have life. Some of us are struggling as to how to have God and life. If we focus on having God, we will have life. If you fall on the side of, no, I'm going to carve out a good life for myself, then God's never going to get what's right for you. God is only going to get what's left. And the Lord is moving us along, slowly but surely.